Thank you. Okay, welcome all. I'm this fella. As it says, I joined the Air Force in '77, left in '97 or retired out. I had the great privilege of spending a significant part of my career at Ahakia. And a big part of that was actually working around the A4 and the accessories around the A4 itself. The A4 and I go back a long time. I had the privilege of living just out of Fielding, and we had the vampires were the ones I remember first flying over the farm. They would fly from Ahakia through to the Manawatu Gorge, and they would typically pass over the top of us. And then we shifted areas, went into the Rangitikei, and that stopped. And then next military aircraft I remember seeing was the Vulcan bomber that came over from the UK. And so my love for aeroplanes sort of started with vampires. Vulcans were part of a memory, and then the next part I remember was one of the air shows at Ahakia where the A4s were brand new. I can't exactly remember when that occurred. It was somewhere around 71, 72. But the air show that I seem to vaguely remember doesn't feature on the Ahakia schedule or the information I can look up that finds out when that actually occurred. But I do remember the A4s when they were brand new and lining up, and then taking the entire main runway to get airborne and screaming out past everything. About 5 minutes after they'd taken off, the VIP DC-3 in the main exhibition hangar here, it took off. It used about 300 feet and then just climbed quietly up. None of the noise, and it's certainly a far more impressive climb rate. So that was one of my first experiences with the A4, was that air show and seeing them continue. And from then on I moved around, and aircraft were part of what I wanted to do. Unfortunately, our family wasn't a wealthy family. Education was, my mum went to work to get me through high school, and I joined the Air Force when I was 17 years old. And that was the start of an amazing career. Going through, I had the fortune of spending, as I said, a big part of that time on 75 Squadron, and started in the conventional aircraft. Now, the A4 is an amazing aircraft. It's probably our second choice. I would love to have seen an F4, but the A4 was a good alternative, and it certainly demonstrated its reliability and performance over the time that it was there. So when I was with 75 Squadron, as a senior NCO, I trained or became a specialist, then an instructor on the aircraft. And as part of my time on the A4, I was also one of the, or for a significant gap, one of the first avionics guys to get authorised for high power engine runs. Now, this is somebody else in the room, I think, got it, but I'm not sure. So working around the A4 was something that I really enjoyed, and then I finished off my career at Wigram here, and then at Woodburn at the training school. I now work as a trainer for an electrical company here in Christchurch called Tate. Now, going back to 75 Squadron. 75 Squadron has an impressive history. 75 Squadron history goes back to World War I. Now, New Zealand Air Force was gifted that history as part of an acknowledgement of our effort. Now, to my knowledge, the New Zealand Air Force is the only Air Force that the UK has actually gifted, or country that they have gifted, a squadron and all its rights to. So again, 75 Squadron, when you have a look at the colour, it actually has 2 recognitions of service during World War I. Again, 75 Squadron flew a number of aircraft, and then went on to the A4, which is what I'm here to talk about. Now, you've got a mixture of images at the top. You've got the A4 in its pre-Kahu state, and images at the bottom with the A4 in its post-Kahu state. Significant upgrade in what it was capable of doing, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So what is this lovely little A4 that was talked about? Well, the design was initially set up for the United States Navy. They wanted an aircraft that would carry or have a maximum weight of around 30,000 pounds. and have a ability to carry a 2,000 pound bomb. And they also defined that it would carry that I haven't committed all this to memory, so around 300 nautical miles as a combat radius. Now, that in itself, for a light bomber, was relatively impressive. Now, the designer of the McDonnell Douglas or A4 actually went away and did a number of innovative designs. Part of it was designing how the wing was structured. Part of it was the size of the aeroplane. Nobody actually expected the aeroplane to be as small as it is, because with the undercarriage up and the weapons load off, this thing's smaller than a Spitfire. So the interesting part is he designed the aeroplane, and then when he submitted his design for a valuation and review, they then moved the benchmark and said we wanted to carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, we want to extend the range of the aircraft, and you're still not allowed to exceed 30,000 pounds. And he said, yep, we can manage that, and that's what they effectively went through and did. Now, the other part is, Navy then said, okay, you reckon you can do it, let's see it. So they then started building the first prototypes, came off the range line in 54, and not long after that, the A4 set the new record for a closed circuit. Now, it was around 500 kilometres or 270 nautical miles, and it managed to do that with an average speed around the circuit of 375 knots, which is fairly impressive for what the circuit is. Again, it was the fastest to do that at that stage. I'm sure there's aircraft today that will beat that quite comfortably. So, entered service in 1956 with the United States Navy, and then in 57 with the Marines. And finally, in 1970, we received our ones. The Australians also bought theirs. They had a number of Skyhawks that were bought for the aircraft carrier. So they initially bought 10 in 67, and they bought another 10 in the early 70s, which we ended up adding to our collection here. Now, the Skyhawk was a very small cockpit, and that's one of the reasons why we've got the single seat cockpit here, is that cockpit space is really, really tight. You don't want to be a big person sitting in that cockpit. And that was part of what allowed it to be a small aircraft. The other part is because it was so small, it felt like the aeroplane fitted them, according to the pilots who've talked to me. And I have sat in the cockpit, and it feels awfully comfortable for a short period of time, and then it gets very painful for a long length of time. And we've done some fairly long flights with the A4. I would hate to have been the pilot that flew it from to Hawaii. Yes, they did tank it a couple of times in the circuit, but it was a long sit down in a very small space. Now, because it was a small cockpit, it effectively felt like the aeroplane was an extension of the pilot's arms and hands. Very easy to fly, very forgiving under most conditions. And so it gained a number of nicknames, and that's why we talked about this session today. Scooter. Scooter was effectively something that anybody can get on and ride, and scooters have come back into lifestyle today. You see them left around the streets everywhere. It was also called Hyman's Hot Rod because this thing actually went really, really well and responded well. Pilots love flying it. And the other part is, in its extension, it also became known as the Bantam Bomber because the A4 was an attack fighter. It was designed to deliver weapons. Again, it carries a fairly impressive weapons load, and its final iterations around 11,000 pounds of weapons. It might be a bit over that, but you're sort of stuck with the capabilities of the hard points on the aircraft. So the first A4, and this is one of them, effectively each aircraft has a BUNO number. That's the serial number of the aircraft when it comes off the production line. The A4s were delivered in 1970. They arrived on a ship. They landed on the wharf in Auckland, and then they were towed from there to Whenuapai. And at Whenuapai they were then unwrapped because they were effectively cocooned as they came off the ship, and we unwrapped them and they went for test flights, and then they turned up in Ohaki around May 1970. Looking at the inside of the cockpit, it's awful lot of stuff in there, and it used to be something that would really keep us busy trying to figure out what was going wrong. The A4 cockpit, as I said, was really small, and for a person like myself, having to get up and behind the instrument panel was not comfortable. So, as I said, it's a lightweight attack aircraft. There are some 2,900 aircraft manufactured and served in multiple countries, and there are still some Skyhawks punching holes in the sky and racing around, enjoying life at the moment. So the New Zealand Air Force purchased the original 14 Skyhawks. They had 10 single seat, 4 T-birds, and then a little bit later on in life we actually acquired the Australian A4s. So we got again 10 aircraft from Australia. There was 8 singles and 2 T-birds, giving us a total fleet of 24 aircraft. I seem to remember, but I can't find a photo, there was a max effort where we put a number of aeroplanes in the sky, and I think we had 22 aeroplanes in the sky for one display. And it was a lot of effort to get that to happen, and I'm very disappointed I don't have a photo of it. So it was just one of those parts. Now, with those 24 aircraft, effectively the Australian ones joined the fleet in around 84, end of 84. And that also is when we started or reinvigorated No.2 Squadron. No.2 Squadron was the effectively going to be used for the test flight as part of Project Kahu. They were the first squadron to get them, and effectively they were the lead squadron from that side of it. The key part there was, what is this Project Kahu? Now, I said the A4 had a fairly impressive a history behind it. Again, one of the parts that I remember hearing about is pilots going out and doing their guns phase, air-to-air combat. And where they're actually firing their guns, they're actually shooting into a banner. Now, for those of you who know about the banner, it's about 20 foot long, it's about 6 foot high. And the aircraft tying the banner normally flies in a circle. Pilots will enter from the inside of the circle, flying out, and put rounds into the gun. They used to paint the rounds so that they could actually track who shot which hole in the banner. So they'd have coloured paint on the rounds. And then at the end of that session, the aircraft would come back, drop the banner on the airfield, and they go and see which coloured dots appeared in the banner. Airplanes would typically go out with 50 to 100 rounds per gun, so they're carrying 100 or 200 rounds. And typically you'd find the lucky pilots would get around 10% of their rounds into the banner, which wasn't too bad because that banner's pretty small. And when you're coming at it at around 400 knots, it gets past you fairly quickly. So one of the key parts is, it was part of their training that they would go and shoot at the banner. They would practice weapons and all of this sort of thing. And when I first joined the Air Force, Skyhawks going out, we had an exercise at Camp Sanson, which is where you did all your weapons and hot stuff. And when the aeroplanes were loaded up there, they were they were reasonably well loaded compared with what they had when I left the squadron. So one of the parts is we'll show you some pictures of Skyhawks heavily loaded, but typically a weapons phase, they would either be doing bombs, and they would carry 4 or 6 bombs, whereas when I left, they would carry 1 or 2. And the key part is the electronics of the aircraft, and what we did in Project Kahu actually allowed the aircraft to become a lot more effective at delivering those targets. So one of the parts is when I left the squadron, we were typically flying with maybe 50 rounds in total. It wasn't many in each gun. We were getting around 10% pre-Kahu rounds through the banner per pilot. With the Kahu upgrade, we were getting close to 80 to 90% of the rounds going through the banner. And that was just because the pilots had this amazing wiggly line that told them where to move the aeroplane. And if you watch some of the movies on TV, you'll see that wiggly line appear at different stages as they fly the aircraft. So aircraft was powered by the J52 engine. This is a brick outhouse of an engine. It takes just about anything and keeps churning. And it's, again, it wasn't initially selected for the Skyhawk, but by the time the New Zealand Air Force got theirs, the J52 engine, which is sort of a cut down variant of what used to be in the 737s. Again, I always thought it was 9,200 pounds of thrust, but looking on the internet it tells me it's 9,300 pounds of thrust. Given the aeroplane weighed around 11,000 pounds clean, unfueled, it was getting fairly well up there for power to weight ratio, unlike some of the newer aircraft today that have actually got more thrust than they have total weight with fuel on board. So again, one of the parts is I'll show you a little bit later on a video clip of a pilot actually getting one of these things in the sky, and it's effectively just a really great engine. I had the sad, I suppose in some ways, happy occasion is we had one of our A4s run into a gannet. Unfortunately, the gannet went down the side of the aircraft, hit the splitter plate and did a whole lot of damage to the aeroplane. We were flown to Auckland to see if we could repair this aircraft so it would fly back to Ahakia. And the airframes senior NCO and I looked at the aircraft and went, we know what we're doing for the rest of our stay here. And then we went and had a beer. Because we arrived on the aircraft with a whole lot of spare bits and pieces. They sent a Herc down to pick us up. And we then took a few days to make the decision that we were going to do was actually pull it apart and then get it down to Blenheim, because effectively it was badly broken. Just surprising what a gannet can do, especially when you, having worked on the aircraft, there's not many places on this aircraft you can't walk or climb. In fact, it was quite a popular viewing platform when you were doing air shows and things like that, because it gave you a view over the crowd. So we've got the engine in here and what it's looking like. When we were running engines, as I said, I was cleared for high power and low power engine runs. Whenever I was running the aircraft, we typically fitted engine screens, especially for high power runs. Now that was mainly to make sure we didn't get anything go down the intake. But the aeroplane, to run the aeroplane at full power, anything over about 75%, you actually had to chain the aeroplane to the ground. Or you had an alternative called Calvert chocks. Effectively, that was how we actually tested the aeroplane. The reason an avionics guy was doing high power engine runs is to actually fault find electrical problems. And the hard part was, whenever we needed somebody to do an engine run, there was never an engines guy or airframes guy available, or we'd have long wait times to get somebody else to do that high power engine run. So I was cleared to do high power engine runs, and I remember my very first high power engine run. I towed out to Camp Sands and set it up. Now what you actually do is you've got a tractor on the front of this thing, you connect the chain up and then you pull that chain as tight as you can with the tractor. Put the brakes on, climb in the cockpit, light the fire, and slowly work the throttle up to full power. The part is at around 90% RPM, that chain appears to stretch. Now the chain actually connects to this point just here around the arrestor hook, and that's after the main pivot point, but with all that thrust and everything else as you roll it up, the nose drops. And it probably only drops about 3 or 4 inches, but it feels like you've moved 100 meters. And it's sort of, your immediate response is pull back on the throttle, and everybody outside laughs because they knew it was coming. But high power engine runs on these, a lot of fun, but it gets really, really quiet as you reach around 92%. The cockpit seems to go just quiet. You can tell the engine's still running in the background, but you really don't pick up a lot of the other noises. It just disappears as you reach that airflow pushing everything past you. So again, I've never actually been in a single seat aeroplane. I've been in this one, and I do have the head-up display tape of that, but yeah, we won't be playing that today because it's too long, because we flew from Ahakia to Akaroa and then back to Ahakia, and we're about 55 minutes, 58 minutes for the trip around the traps. Now inside the pre-Kahu Skyhawk, part of my history was dealing with the nav computer. So we had the ASN 41 nav computer, and that's a horrible piece of machinery to work on. It's all analog servos and synchros and resolvers and a whole lot of other stuff. But it would navigate the pilots reasonably reliably on a sortie. They had the all attitude indicator. We referred to it as the abba-jabba. It's a fully moving meatball that gives you your horizon, and as you move the aircraft around, you can do anything to the aircraft and it tells you which way the world is up. Unfortunately, when we did Kahu, this thing went away. And then we found out a problem with the new instrumentation. I might tell you about that sometime. But one of the key parts there is it was a really impressive navigation system, which we then replaced with an inertial nav. So setting that up, you had a gyro and magnetic sensors on the aeroplane that allowed you to record where the aircraft was and display it to the pilot. As I said, in '84 we bought the Australian A4s, and you'll notice that the Australian A4s, slightly different colour scheme because they were operating off a carrier, but they also didn't have the hump, and that's largely because the aeroplanes were a little bit of an earlier design than ours. The A4Ks had the hump on them, which were that hump was largely empty, and I think we had one box in there, but it could carry a whole lot more stuff if we actually wanted it to. The part is when we were flying the Australian A4s in air combat, the pilots found out the Australian ones were fractionally faster. Pilots don't like that. So what we then did was we made a decision to remove the humps off our Skyhawks so that they all perform the same. Now, from the Kahu side of it, it would have been really nice if we left the hump on there, but we didn't. So one of the parts is that made a slight difference to the aircraft itself. So looking at the fuel system of the Skyhawk, as I said, this thing was initially designed to do a sortie of 300, or combat radius of 300 nautical miles. And then they increased that combat range to 400, and then effectively the aircraft still performed fairly well. How did it achieve those extensions was the fitting of external fuel tanks. Now there are 3 external fuel tanks. Single seat aircraft typically flew with the centerline store, which gave them an extra 3,600 pounds of kerosene, on top of the 5,200 pounds of kerosene that they carried in the aircraft itself. Now 5,200 pounds is typically about a half-hour sortie, so she burns it fairly quickly. Adding the extra 3,600 pounds gives you quite a combat radius, and that 400 nautical mile radius you could actually do on a centerline store. So that was one of the key parts. If you wanted a bit more, you could actually fit the 2,000 pound on drop tanks on stations 2 and 4, and that gave you a total fuel load from memory of about 11,800 pounds. With sorry, no, that's not. That's 9.2 with the 2 external stores. 9,200 pounds on a good day would get you to Australia. Not a lot of reserve. And when we first took the A4s to Australia, the Australians had been bringing their Mirages to New Zealand. The Mirages normally landed at Norfolk Island, and our pilots did the numbers, said yes, we can make Australia with a full fuel load, so they put the 3 drop tanks up. Now the 3rd drop tank just gives you a safety margin, and actually the drag index by adding the 3rd drop tank nearly equates to the amount of fuel you're carrying. But so we plan to take the A4s to Australia, and without doing the stop in Norfolk Island, the Australians say you'll never do it. So we did. And then we spent half an hour in the circuit doing touch and goes. Now, I'm not saying we were actually at our legal requirements, because the Skyhawk, when you come back to the airfield, you're supposed to have 1,000 pounds on the gauge, which is your divert fuel. And so I'm not sure that they had 1,000 pounds when they taxied onto the flight line, but they certainly demonstrated they could do that quite comfortably. You could actually take an 80 knot headwind all the way from New Zealand to Australia and get there comfortably. Anything much over 80 knots and the variabilities that come with that, they're generally aborted and waited for another day. So whenever we deployed, we were looking for a slightly lower trans-Tasman breeze. So the key part is the external fuel tanks used air pressure to pump the fuel out of the drop tanks. So as a guy on the flight line, when they were going for a flight, you actually had to go out there, they would pressurise the drop tanks, and then they would depressurise them, and you had to put your hand underneath the fuel tank and get a puff of kerosene and air over your hand. Avtur doesn't smell great. So you go through, you do check the tanks depressurised, that means they were getting pressurised, and the fuel had to go into the fuel tank if it was pressurised. So that was part of it. Now the other part is you had a fuel pump that sat at the front of the wing. So, sorry, fuel pump sat at the emergency pump is at the front of the wing. The main fuel pump is at the back. So we had aeroplanes sometimes had problems because they spent too long doing a descent into a Hakia, didn't pick up all the fuel in their wing. The part is the big bag on the left-hand side of that screen is the fuselage cell. Now that fuel cell sits just behind the pilot seat. Holds about 1,400 pounds in an A4 and 400 pounds in a TE A4. That's how they fit the extra seater. When that fuel tank gets empty, you have a problem because that's the one that feeds the engine. And if the engine doesn't have fuel, the fire goes out. So there are fuel sensors in there that detects whether the pilot is having a problem with the fuel flow. First thing the pilot does when that light comes on is hit emergency transfer, which puts air pressure into the wing and uses the emergency transfer pump sitting at the front. So that's one of the parts. So that's part of the fuel system, and my mouse has moved because Alex has been moving. Okay, so this is the A4, this is 1984, this is the one of the air shows that I had the fun of going to, and you can see the A4 is fairly heavily armed here. It's got AIM-9 missiles. These are the earlier AIM-9s, and then looking at the left-hand image, you'll see we've got a 19-shot CRV-7 2 3/4 inch rockets. They could be have HE and all sorts of different nasties on them. You could actually fly two 19-shot pods off stations 2 and 4. You could have 3 on the centre line, and you could have 1 on stations 1 and 5, giving you somewhere around 190 rockets to throw at somebody. Which there is actually, with the Kahu update, they actually developed a flight profile where the aeroplane can fly a parabolic arc and fire a whole lot of these off. Now on the right hand side you'll see another rocket pod, and this is called the Zuni rocket. This is a 5 and a bit inch rocket designed to be similar to a 6-inch cruiser shell and designed to punch holes and things. Again, the aeroplane could carry quite a few of those if it needed to. And at different stages when we were doing maritime problems where people have gone fishing and they don't have the right to be fishing, we'd send Skyhawks out to go and find them and tell them to heave to. And flying with rockets and things like that was part of that deployment. So throughout the year when we had the Skyhawks, there are different times where we'd have to arm aeroplanes and send them out because the P3 had actually found somebody fishing inside New Zealand waters and asked them to pull over and stop. The policeman's coming, and the policeman was the Navy. So the A4s would go out there, buzz past them, P3 would say, please stop, and they didn't, so they'd then go to guns would be the next part, and then they'd line up for a rocket shot, and they'd go through different sequences of rockets. The idea is you just shoot across the bow of the ship. He generally stops, but that was one of the parts, and 365 days of the year we had to be capable of doing that. So that was part of what happened at a Hakia, was there were always weapons kept in the bomb dump that were ready to be deployed. Not fully assembled, but they're ready for use. As you can see, you've got the different parts of the aircraft. I'll show you an image of what we did post-Kahu. So what did we do with Project Kahu? Again, it was trying to create an aeroplane that was an F-16 for a cheap price. So the first part we did was we put a radar in it, the APG-66. The APG-66 had a special mode that was developed for New Zealand for maritime interdiction, because up until that stage they were used in the F-16, and the F-16, that wasn't its task, so it didn't have a maritime mode, so that was added to it. Key part for the pilots was to go to a HOTAS, or hands-on throttle and stick environment. That meant that the pilot had somewhere around 60 switches or positions and things to do with his fingers and thumbs, which kept him fairly busy, remembering how to use them all. The aircraft had some 60 plus different modes that you could fly it in with these different things, depending on how you wanted navigation, air to ground, air to air weapons and sub modes inside those. Now, getting around the place, we talked about the Abba-Jabba compass. This was replaced with an inertial nav. Inertial nav, it was a ring laser gyro platform, and it would plot where you are in the world. So much easier today, you can use GPS that can improve this, but first off, you have to tell the aeroplane where it is in the world. So as a part of setting or starting the fire and this thing and lighting it up, the pilots would actually go through and check that the spot which the aeroplane was parked on, he would actually know the GPS coordinates of that spot, and he would make sure that was so as he was going through. He would then power up the aircraft, leave the aircraft running for a period of time while the inertial aligns, and then eventually it'll tell him what his error is, and then it will tell him that the aircraft is, the inertial nav's aligned. At that stage he is now cleared to taxi, because he's not allowed to move until that actual state unless he does a 90-degree turn and he wants a high accuracy update. So looking inside the aircraft, you've got the old cockpit and what it was capable of. You did have a radar, but it was more of a terrain avoidance radar. On the right hand side in the centre, this is what a Kahu aircraft looked like, and I actually found an image which was more of a marketing image that gives you a bit more view of what the glass screens look like. Again, the aircraft was capable of now being remotely programmed, so pilots could create their nav task. They would load that into the data transfer module in their office, and that would include their waypoints and places like this that they wanted to visit, or where they were, what they were doing would all be loaded into the data transfer module. Put that in the aircraft, they would upload that into the aeroplane, and then they could go out and complete the task. And that was part of what they did. Again, all the switches inside the cockpit, all the key switches are physically shaped so that the pilot, without looking at them, can tell he's got the right switch. Because when you're flying low at a relatively high speed, you don't want to be looking at which switch you've reached for. So there's certain switches that are key laid out. The other part that is part of this is we went to a head-up display, and the head-up display tells the pilot a lot of things with great data. We're going to show you a couple of video clips of that, but along with the head-up display, we also included a head-up display camera, so we could capture information from the aircraft. Now, as the pilots went out and completed a sortie and came back with a problem or problems, we could take the data transfer module, we could download data or events from the data transfer module. We could also look at the head-up display to record what was actually the pilot was talking about, if there was something was supposed to be there. So a lot of information that went through. This is a nighttime shot of showing you what happens or what can be seen in the head-up display. Again, a lot of information. The hard part is, if you're looking at this, you're not looking outside the cockpit, so it becomes a key part of what's going on. Now, the whole system itself, all connected together via a data bus, and lots of different modules in it. Things that kept me and a couple of others heavily focused on continuous learning and effectively going through it, but depending on whether it was an A4 or a T-bird, there was just duplication in the T-bird, but all the functionality was there. And then one of the parts that you could also go through, and this is where we would get into some of the diagnostics, is you effectively had a way of tracking that the pilot did actually operate the switches in the right sequence, or that he operated the switch, something should have happened and it didn't, so we can investigate them. So that was a big change, because one of the parts prior to Kahu, when a pilot said he had a fault, first part is you have to verify the fault, because you can't fix it if you can't verify it. And effectively this digitisation of the aircraft was one of the key parts. So this is how we'd go through and start diagnosing, looking at different modes inside the aircraft, what's happening, testing that things actually work through it. It's all part of what we did on a daily basis. Now this is a short video clip of a A4. He's starting up on the flight line. So you can see his going through a gyro compass. As nav is ready, it's got an error rate of 0.8, which is about the point where it says I'm happy to go. Now you might hear a beacon running in the background. Pilot's just loading up his nav information. In this case, the pilot's actually doing it for himself. He's not actually loading it into the data transfer module. And we're not hearing the comms, but effectively he'll be talking to air traffic control, asking for permission to taxi. Now, pilots have numbers. They don't use names. And the control tower knows about which flights. So here he is at the end of the runway. What he's going to do is he goes through, runs the engine up to about 85%.
85% manual, lights on, fluctuations normal, back primary, trims, lights out, all looking good. Okay, time to take off. ETR is good, 97%, 46,520 and rising. Trim stable, no finite, airspeed rising. Spoilers, radar to air, gear is up, flap up.
And what he's about to do is change to a different channel. So he's going to COM stud 6. And then it should stop about here.
Number two. Good afternoon, mission variable. What are your part in space? Amber fluid identified. Amber.
Yeah, it should finish about there. I'm just not still going to let it run because I've talked too long already. So this is the Post-Kahu warload, and there's a person here that actually may have been heavily involved with this image. So effectively we're seeing on here, you've still got your CRV-7s. This is a 6-shot rocket pod. Most of the pilots typically after Kahu would fly with 2 rockets in the pod, not 6. There's a video clip at the end of the session if you've got time, which actually has a pilot going out and firing these rockets. Inside that you've got the Mark 82 bombs. These are 500 pounders. You've got what could be a Mark 83, which is a 1,000 pounder. And then you've got on the stations 2 and 4, and you've got a white. These are the Mavericks missiles, which give us standoff either infrared or TV guided weaponry, and effectively are designed for ship kills or going after tanks and things like that. Quite impressive when you can see what they can do. So the A4 could carry a number of those on the aircraft, and there was actually a missions profile that was created by No.75 Squadron, which has had an aircraft fully loaded with CRV-7s and therefore about 190 rockets. The thought process is you would have 2 aircraft fully loaded with rockets, you have 2 aircraft fully loaded with Maverick missiles. 2 aircraft with CRV-7s would do a pop about 15 miles or 15 nautical miles from the target and start firing their rockets as ripple salvo, which means the ship's got an incoming pile of 190 rockets coming from either side of the ship. The whole idea was to saturate the ship's fire control system. Meanwhile, the other 2 A4s come burning in as low as they can, which is scary low, and they will go with the Maverick missiles around 8 to 5 to 8 nautical miles from the ship. Hopefully they're distracted and the Mavericks have a reasonable chance of actually taking the ship out. So again, fairly impressive aeroplane for what it was designed to do, and very impressive for its price. Again, we don't always practice with real weapons, so you have these little blue things, and they simulate whether the bombs are high drag or slick, which means how do you fly the aeroplane, and they are designed to give a typical trajectory for a Mark 82, Mark 83 bomb. Now you could put Mark 84s on the Skyhawk, but you had to be careful where you put them, because the Mark 84 was a 2,000 pound bomb, and you often needed fuel. Now we operated, 75 Squadron had a long history. It had its 50th birthday, so we created the Gold Budgie, which commemorated 50 years of the operation of 75 Squadron. I think that's what it was. RNZAF, was it? It was a bit of fun. It was still the Gold Budgie. The hard part was the gold paint kept coming off. So it was just one of those things. Again, in my time with the squadron, I got to spend time with the aerobatics team. This is the 1990 workup session, and the group that was responsible for that. That was a particularly bad year because that was the first time we actually lost a pilot during an aerobatics display. And to this day, it's still a memory that I wish I hadn't had. Okay, so I've talked for long enough. I don't know how I've gone for time, but again, thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the museum. Our next